Minister, when you came before the House last week with your version of events, I told you were caught out at that time. Caught out concealing donations that weren't declared at the time in 2016. Caught out in relation to, despite the fact that you had information back in 2017 of the use of the company van, that you didn't do anything about it. Caught out when the journalists contacted you in 2020, in November of that year, and you said your team reviewed everything and that there was no need to make any adjustments, that everything was okay. And it was only when SIPO actually wrote to you that you created this narrative here to reverse engineer the numbers to make it all seem plausible. But the question I put to you on 4 occasions last week was the one you could not answer. The information you gave this House was even how many tickets Michael Stone bought off you in a national draw, but you failed to tell us that he paid to put up your election posters in not just 1 but 2 elections. And the reason you couldn't answer that question, because you knew at that time that you were caught out again. So can I ask you a specific question? In 2017, who made the allegation in relation to the use of the company van, Michael Stone's company van, in the erection of the posters? Can you answer that question? Also, when you had repeated requests by media in November of 2022, when you said you carried out a review, who carried out the review? And at that stage, did you know of the involvement of Michael Stone in relation to postering?
Thank you, Doherty, for your questions. I think it's very important to be clear when you use the word donation. What exactly we are referring to here is an inadvertent corporate donation that I've now declared and will return to SIPO. But the donation that you use repeatedly, at the heart of this is the issue of postering. And the donation that you refer to is the commercial value that is attributed to posters that I did not know were being paid for and that I assumed to be voluntary. So every time you use the word donation, which you're correct to raise, I will make the point back that this refers to postering that I assume to be done on a voluntary basis. The 2 questions that you put to me there is who made the allegation passed on the point in 2017. It was, I believe, at that point a journalist. I've been unable to determine who. And in relation to the review that I initiated from the end of November across December, which took some time to do, at that time I believed, but it took me some time to establish, that all the support that I received had been on a voluntary basis.
First of all, I asked you who carried out the review. You actually informed the journalists, at least one journalist, that you carried out a review and you didn't need to change your declaration. We now know that that was not true. We now know that 2016 that you got a donation of postering in that campaign and again in 2020. So who carried out the review and how were you able to issue that response in November, another cover-up in relation to this political donation? And in relation to 2017, when it was brought to your attention, what did you do when somebody pointed out to you that the company van was used in erecting your posters at that time?
So thank you for recognising that the donation that we are referring to here is the putting up of posters. It's posters that I assumed was happening on a voluntary basis that has created an issue that I now must be accountable for in relation to the return of my SIPO forms and expenses, which I have done. In relation to who carried out the review, I asked those who were involved in my constituency organisation and my team who've been involved in the campaign. And as I said, up until recently, and I made a return in relation to my expenses for 2016, I believe that activity had been provided on a voluntary basis. At campaign time, we put up many hundreds of posters in Dublin Central. I assume they were all put up on a voluntary basis. That's the nature of the issue.
So just to clarify this.
And then just to answer the question that you put to me then regarding the action that I didn't take in 2017, that is one of the many issues that I hold myself accountable for, Count Corla. I look back at that point, and at that point what I should have done in 2017 when I became aware of the issue is I should have amended my electoral expenses at that time to take account of the use of a commercial van that had at that point a value of €140. It is one of the examples of my assuming that activity had been provided on a voluntary basis.
Minister, now you're talking down the clock.
Issue,
well, let me ask the questions. Because you told the media after your review that there was nothing to see here. But you're after telling the House that during the review that you've identified that Michael Stone put up the posters in 2016. You're also after telling the House that there were some in your team that recollected that Michael Stone made a contribution in 2020. Now, Pascal, please come clean on this here. How many posters did Michael Stone put up in 2016 and 2020? And don't take the mickey out of this here and tell us that he only put up 75 polls. Tell us, how many posters were you putting up?
Minister.
Thanks, Deputy, for your two questions. Firstly, to be clear, it was only as I initiated a more thorough review of the 2016 campaign, in the aftermath of receiving further contact, that it became apparent to me that those individuals had been paid, but they were not paid for by me. They were not paid for by Fine Gael Dublin Central. No, I acknowledge the point. The key issue here is at that point it constituted the declaration, and I accept that point. The key mistake that I made, which I've acknowledged to the House this evening, was an acknowledgement that I had assumed they were all done on a voluntary basis.
Six men, 3 vans, 5 nights. How many posters did they put up?
In relation to how many posters that were put up, I'm afraid I have not been able to determine how many posters were put up. But what I have been able to determine...
You're just
what I have been able to... So, Deputy, I don't know if you're interested in my answer or my head. But what you're going to get is the best answers that I have
and last week there you wouldn't answer any of the questions because it is a cock and bull story. And you've been caught out time and time again, not just in terms of accepting undeclared political donations. What a cover-up that has gone on week after week.
To determine, hold on. All the information I have,
please, Minister, hold on. Please do not attempt to shout down the Minister. You've asked him a question, let him answer it. And he will. Let the Minister answer, please. Minister.
As I said, I have not been able to determine the number of posters that were put up, but on the information that has been supplied to me, I've been able to determine the commercial value of the labour that was involved in putting up the posters and the commercial value of the vehicles that were involved in doing it. And they, Count Corla, form most of the revision that needs to be made from an expenses point of view. But as I've indicated to the House, a further revision needs to be made with regard to what I now accept was a corporate donation that I've now acted upon with SIPO.
Thank you. We need to move on. Deputy Jed Nash, please.
Of course, Minister, the commercial value isn't the value that Mr Stone or yourself would ascribe to the value of the service that you describe it as and what you want it to be. It is what it would cost you on the open market to obtain that particular service. Now, we'd prefer if we were here today talking about housing and health, for example, the issues that affect everybody's everyday lives, that goes to the core of the business that we should be doing here in this House today and every day. And they're the real issues that matter. But this matters too, Minister. Standards matter, accountability matters, ethics matters, transparency and full disclosure matters. And I believe that standards matter to you too as well, Minister. And I believe that integrity matters to you too. But today we know from Mr Stone's statement that, and it gives me no pleasure to say this, that you broke the electoral rules on 2 occasions, in 2016 and in 2020. And you have a second chance today to put this issue to bed once and for all, because, as we all know, third chances don't come along every day in politics. So, if you genuinely want to make a clean breast of this, Minister, I want to put a number of questions to you. And I'm pleased that you have decided to take the Labour Party's advice and to return elements of what are prohibited donations from Mr Stone to him and to amend your statement to SIPO accordingly. But at the kernel of this is this fantasy that the donations that were made to Dublin Central Fine Gael and not to you personally, the guy on the poster. And I think to address that fiction and fantasy, you need to accept that and you need to acknowledge that these are donations that were made to you and that insofar as we can establish, they did not, as described, comply with the law. So you've doubled down on these as donations made to the party and not to you as a candidate. And let's look, if we can, for a moment at Mr Stone's statement today on this assistance for a friend. And he said, and I quote, "The help given in 2020 was arranged through a member of Fine Gael in Dublin Central." And Minister, this is important, and I don't want to be dragging people unnecessarily into this. Genuinely don't. Who was that member? Was that member your election agent? And it is very, very important to establish that, because it is only, in electoral law, it is only the election agent who can legally authorise expenditure. So did Stone's donations and that expenditure have the imprimatur of your election agent at any time? And is there a paper trail which is required between a third party who's providing a service and the election agent? That's required in law. And then furthermore, Minister, if the donation was in fact made to Fine Gael Dublin Central, then if I were the second candidate in 2020, I'd be really annoyed. I'd be really annoyed, because it seems that she hasn't benefited from the assistance provided by Mr Stone. So how did your running mate benefit, if indeed this was a donation to Fine Gael in Dublin Central? And if she didn't, then this is really starting to look like what we believe it is, which is a personal donation made by a corporation that went undeclared. It's de facto a donation made to you personally, Minister.
Thanks, Deputy. I agree ethics and standards do matter. It is why I am so disappointed to be in this position, having to explain who put up my posters, having to explain that I assumed it happened on a voluntary basis, and having to take up the time of the House making a justification for it, let alone having to revise my expenses statements with SIPO. In relation to the point that you've made there regarding my breaking the law, I think was the phrase that you used, it gives me no pleasure at all to hear that statement made with regard to me, which is why I take this issue so seriously. I acknowledge the mistakes that were made, but respectfully, Deputy, it is up to the Standards and Public Office Commission to form a view in relation to this matter, to evaluate my action, my intention, what I've done to try to ameliorate this issue, and I will engage with them in any way. In relation to the two questions that you put to me, who is the person who received the postering at the time? It was the Fine Gael councillor for the North Inner City, Ray McAdam. He received the postering. What was the support that was received to the second candidate, and the point that you make regarding the nature of the account. All of the funding, all of the support that was received at election time goes into the central party political account, which is the Fine Gael Dublin Central account. If I had received anything personally, I would be revising my personal statements, but I did not. All of the funding, any support that was received went in there. But I go back to the key point here. It's important to, again, be clear regarding what is the nature of the donation. The nature of the donation is the value that is attributed to posters being put up. At no point was money received that needed to be put into that account.
Service, and there's a commercial value to be placed on that, and that's a matter that will be determined in time by the Standards and Public Office Commission. I hope that they do their work expeditiously. But I do maintain that this is a fiction, that this donation of a service, which has a commercial value, which is a donation, that it was given to Fine Gael Dublin Central, because that would have implications then for the second candidate and potentially for the second candidate's returns, and that may need to be reviewed. I'll say just finally, with this limited amount of time that I have available, the Taoiseach said earlier on that he believes you. He's entitled to say that, and he's right to say that people will make their own judgments later on today about the veracity of what it is that you say. And I would ask you to do this, Minister, as somebody who I know values integrity in public life. In the interest of transparency and full disclosure, I would ask you to publish fully all of your returns to SIPO, your amended returns in 2016 and in 2020, including all of the supporting documentation, to ensure that there is absolute full disclosure. I appreciate that you're not obliged to do so, but I believe it would be very helpful and in the public interest for you to do so.
Thank you, Deputy Nash, and I do appreciate your recognition of the value that I do place in integrity and standards, and I am so aware of the issues that I have created due to the postering activity that happened on my behalf at election time. And that is the issue. Who put up my posters, assuming they happened on a voluntary basis? In relation to the point that you've put to me, thank you again for recognising this was a donation of a service. On the point that you've made regarding making information available, of course, I'll make any information available that I'm making
right.
available to SIPO.
Minister,
but the one point I will need to check, Deputy, is whether that in any way will impinge upon or influence the requirements that SIPO have upon me. But assuming there's no difficulty there, any information that is available to me that constitutes my input to SIPO and my amended expenses, I'd make available.
We go now to Deputy Roisin Shortall, please.
Thank you. Minister, the point was made last week that the question here is not that errors were made or issues arose. The key thing is, how are those issues responded to when they do arise or when those errors are made? And it has to be said that in terms of your response to this and in terms of your government's response to it, you've made a complete hames of this. And I think that's a charitable reading of the situation. At the core of your defence is you saying that you thought that this work was being done on a voluntary basis. Now, that is a very revealing statement to make. You thought that it was being done on a voluntary basis. How could anybody with any political experience at all think that vans with corporate signage on them and teams of guys in high-vis jackets are doing this work on a voluntary basis? I mean, how could you possibly think that that was the case? And the other point about this is, even if you are claiming that you were completely ignorant of the rules, ignorance of the law, of course, is no defence. And it's particularly not a defence when the breaching of those laws is being done by the minister who is responsible for implementing that law. So, I mean, are you really expecting us to believe that, first of all, you thought that this has been done on a voluntary basis, and secondly, that it was okay if it was being done on a voluntary basis? Are you not familiar with the returns that you have to make every year, that we all have to make every year, in relation to, for example, donations, where under question 3 of the donation statement, which we're all filling in at the moment this month, where there's one question that refers to the nature of donations, and there's a footnote to say, for example, cash, cheque, use of property, services, etc. Now, that seems perfectly clear. As the minister responsible for that law, how do you expect us to believe that you were ignorant of it and that you thought this was voluntary work?
Minister.
Thanks very much, Deputy, for your questions. So I want to just pick up on the point you've made there, that ignorance in face of the law is no defence. And of course the law, SIPO, will impartially evaluate what has happened here and the consequences of it. So not knowing is not a defence. But I think proportionality in political debate is also a point I would make. And you made reference to political experience, and I know you have very extensive political experience in your many successful election campaigns in the constituency beside me. But I have some political experience too. And I have political experience of being a candidate, particularly in the 2020 campaign, where I was performing a national duty on behalf of my party. No. I was very in my constituency
with all due
office.
Respect, Minister,
and the reality of it is, I'll conclude,
now.
I'm going to conclude briefly, but I am going to answer it, that if you're in an environment where the vast majority, if not all of your activities happen on a voluntary basis, the assumption that I made is that a small share of it was too.
I'm taking that as your answer, Minister.
And I just want to make a final point in relation to it, just again to emphasise, my campaign or I was not paying for this.
Right,
and the
Minister,
mistake that I acknowledge I made was not checking if somebody else was.
Thank you.
Okay, I've heard what you've said. So look, there's a number of forms that we're required to fill out after an election. So the election expenses statement from 2016 and 2020. So is it the case then, Minister, that you've amended both of those documents to include additional expenditure?
So the 2016 one has already been amended.
Right.
The 2020 one will be amended very shortly.
Okay, so is there a corresponding correction that needs to be made then in relation to the donation statements, which of course would have been filled in kind of the best part of a year after the election? Surely if you're saying you have to change the election expenses declaration in relation to your expenses in your election campaign, surely that also requires a donation statement correction for both elections.
But I've already said that I am amending my corporate donations form, or that of Fine Gael Dublin Central. So I've already said, I've already said that a revision will be made to take account of a donation that was inadvertently received to the commercial value of the van that has been used. So I've already said I'm willing to do that.
Okay, but the other aspects,
and then the expenses form. Sorry, Deputy, Deputy, I'm answering the question to you. We have amended 2016. We will amend 2020 shortly, and I'm not aware of the need to make a revision to any other donations form apart from the corporate one that will happen shortly, and we are refunding back a share of that which I acknowledge should not have been received, but was in the commercial use of a van.
Minister, I made the point last week that what you're doing and the explanation you're providing for these various figures sounds very much like reverse engineering to suit the rules. But of course that's not the case. In relation to donations, I've already said, you know, goods and services have to have a commercial value and be declared as donations. Now, you seem to be suggesting that these were not donations. You know, Mr. Stone putting up the posters for you, paying people to put up the posters and providing the vans was not a donation to you, but to the party. Is that correct?
I've made clear on a number of occasions. Sorry, I've made clear that these were expenses that were accrued by Fine Gael Dublin Central.
No, Minister, sorry. You're confusing expenses and donations.
You're asking me a question, and I'm going to answer it. And my understanding, having assessed this matter thoroughly, is the main donation here that needs to be reviewed is that from a corporate perspective, which has now happened.
Okay, I'm not talking.
Excuse me, which will happen.
I'm not talking. Just bear with me, just for a couple of moments. I'm not talking about the corporate donation. I'm talking about the donations in kind that you got, with people being paid to put up your posters, and the provision of vans. Now, you, as I understand it, said last week that they were actually donations to the party. So how did you?
Point, Deputy,
how did you? No, I'm looking for an answer to this question. How did you relay? Sorry, how did you relay that information to the party that there were donations to the party?
Please, Deputy
and
Shortall,
did you, as you're required to do, get an acknowledgement of that donation? Because under the guidelines, you're required to get an acknowledgement from the party if you're saying the donations went to the party.
I'm not aware of what this concept is of a donation in kind. What I'm referring to here is an expense,
Minister.
and my expenses form have been submitted,
it's in
and
the
I
guidelines.
have made clear on a number of occasions that these were expenses that were accrued by Fine Gael Dublin Central.
And did you get an acknowledgement of that, Minister?